It was February 2022 in Sacramento. The winter light came in flat and colorless through my kitchen blinds when the call came from my mother's doctor: mild cognitive decline, possible early dementia. I bought the tracker that same night, the kind that plugs under the steering column and updates on my phone every hour. I told myself it was for safety, not suspicion. My mother, 82, had always been cautious, proud, careful with every dollar of my late father's insurance. So when the alert started showing daily trips across town to a casino off Interstate 80, I thought it had to be an error. But it wasn't. And when I saw my brother's car parked beside hers, night after night, I realized her confusion wasn't memory loss. It was a lie we'd all been living inside. That tracker didn't just show me where she was going. It showed me who we really were. Ellen Hart was 48 years old when she first noticed the small changes. It was late February, and Sacramento's winter had settled into that gray, formless stretch where the days felt shorter than they actually were. She worked as a financial analyst for a regional accounting firm, the kind of work that required precision but rarely drama. Numbers, spreadsheets, quarterly projections, predictable patterns that made sense when you looked at them long enough. Her mother, Margaret Hart, was 82, a widow for 6 years. Sharp-minded, independent, the kind of woman who still balanced her checkbook by hand every month and refused to let anyone else touch her mail. Ellen's father had left behind a modest life insurance policy, nothing extravagant, but enough to keep Margaret comfortable, to cover the mortgage-free house in Carmichael, to pay for groceries and utilities and the occasional lunch with her church group. Ellen had one sibling, David, 45, 3 years younger. A contractor by trade, though work had been sporadic lately. He lived 20 minutes away in an apartment complex near Wood Avenue, drove a blue Toyota sedan, and had always been the one who could make their mother laugh. Charming. Easy with words. Quick to offer help. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Ellen was at her desk, reviewing a client's tax documents, when her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. She answered. "Ms. Hart? This is Dr. Liang's office." Dr. Liang was Margaret's primary care physician. Ellen's pulse ticked up slightly. "Yes, your mother had her follow-up appointment yesterday. Dr. Liang would like to discuss some findings with you. Are you available to come in tomorrow morning?" Ellen scheduled the appointment for 9 a.m. the next day. She didn't tell David. Not yet. She wanted to hear it herself first. The clinic was a low brick building off Fair Oaks Boulevard, tucked between a dentist's office and a pharmacy. Ellen arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room, flipping through a health magazine without reading it. The receptionist called her name at 9:03. Dr. Liang was a woman in her mid-50s, efficient and direct. She gestured for Ellen to sit. "Your mother completed the cognitive assessment yesterday." Ellen nodded. "The results show a mild decline in short-term recall and some inconsistency in sequencing tasks. It's not definitive for dementia, but it suggests early impairment. We'll want to monitor her closely over the next 6 months." Ellen looked at the printed summary on the desk. Boxes checked. Scores circled. The words "possible early dementia" are typed in bold at the bottom. What does that mean for her day-to-day? Dr. Liang folded her hands. "She should be fine living independently for now. But you'll want to keep an eye on her driving, her medications, her finances. Make sure she's not getting confused." Ellen took the summary and folded it into her purse. That evening, she drove to her mother's house. The front porch light was on. Margaret answered the door in a cardigan and slippers, her white hair pinned back neatly. "I wasn't expecting you. I wanted to check in." They sat at the kitchen table. Ellen made tea. Margaret talked about the weather, about a neighbor's new dog, about the price of eggs. She seemed fine. Present. Aware. But Ellen watched closely now, looking for signs she might have missed before. "Mom, Dr. Liang called me." Margaret's expression didn't change. "She worries too much. She said you had some trouble with the memory test. Those tests are ridiculous." Ellen let the silence sit for a moment. Then she reached across the table and touched her mother's hand. "I just want to make sure you're safe." Margaret pulled her hand back gently. "I've been fine for 82 years. Ellen drove home that night and sat in her car in the driveway for a long time. The dashboard clock read 10:15. She unlocked her phone and searched for GPS trackers. The results filled the screen, dozens of options, reviews, comparison charts. She chose one that plugged into the OBD2 port under the steering column, battery-powered, real-time updates every hour. Delivery in 2 days. The package arrived on Saturday morning. Ellen opened it at her kitchen table. The device was small, black, rectangular, no bigger than a deck of cards. The instructions were simple. Plug it in. Download the app. Create an account. Wait for the first ping. She drove to her mother's house that afternoon. Margaret was in the backyard, pulling weeds from the garden bed near the fence. Ellen parked in the driveway and walked around to the driver's side of her mother's car, a silver Honda Accord, 15 years old, immaculate. "Mom, I'm going to check your tire pressure." Margaret waved from the garden. "They're fine." Ellen knelt beside the driver's door, opened it, and leaned under the steering column. The OBD port was exactly where the diagram showed. She pressed the tracker into place until it clicked. Then she closed the door, stood, and brushed the dust from her knees. All set. That night, Ellen opened the app on her phone. The tracker showed up as a blue dot on a map. Location: 3200 block of Garfield Avenue, Carmichael. Last update: 7:12 p.m. Status: parked. She set the app to notify her of any ignition activity. 2 days later, at 2:03 in the morning, her phone buzzed. She woke to the sound, groggy, reaching for the nightstand. The screen glowed in the dark. Vehicle ignition detected. She opened the app. The blue dot was moving. Ellen sat up, watching. The dot traveled south on Garfield, turned left onto Fair Oaks, continued east. It moved slowly, stopping at lights, turning carefully. After 31 minutes, it returned to the original location and stopped. Ellen screenshot the route. She sent it to herself via email. Then she set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe she needed air. Or maybe something else. The next morning, Ellen called her mother. Margaret answered on the third ring. "Did you sleep okay last night?" "Like a stone." "You didn't go anywhere." There was a pause. "Why would I?" Ellen didn't push. She just noted the time of the call in her planner, 8:47 a.m., February 27th. Over the next 2 weeks, the tracker logged 3 more late-night trips. Always between midnight and 3 a.m., always returning within 40 minutes. Ellen saved each route. She cross-referenced the coordinates with satellite view. The destination was always the same, a parking lot off Elkhorn Boulevard, bordered by a frontage road and a chain-link fence. She zoomed in. The lot belonged to a large building with a lit sign, Golden Prairie Casino. Ellen stared at the screen for a long time. Then she closed the app and went to bed. The next morning, she called Nora Feld, her coworker and friend. Nora was 51, divorced, methodical. She worked in the same office, 2 cubicles down. "Can you look at something for me?" They met for coffee during lunch. Ellen showed her the app, the routes, the timestamps. Nora scrolled through the screenshots. "Your mom." "Yes. At 2 in the morning. 3 times last week." Nora handed the phone back. "Could be insomnia. Could be. Or something else." Ellen nodded. "I just want to be sure." Nora stirred her coffee. "Keep logging it." Ellen kept logging it. By mid-March, the late-night trips had stopped. But new patterns emerged. Weekday mornings. Always between 11 and 2 in the afternoon. The same route. The same parking lot. The same duration, usually 2 to 3 hours. Ellen began visiting her mother more often. Short visits, casual. She'd bring groceries, check the mail, wipe down the counters. Margaret was always polite, always composed. But Ellen started noticing small things. A glossy card on the kitchen counter, tucked under a napkin. Ellen glanced at it while her mother was in the bathroom. Golden Prairie Casino Players Club. Margaret's name printed across the front, a barcode on the back. Ellen took a photo with her phone. Then she returned the card to the exact same position. Another time, Ellen arrived to find her mother sorting through a stack of receipts at the kitchen table. Margaret gathered them quickly when Ellen walked in. "Just organizing." Ellen sat down. Need help? I've got it. Ellen glanced at the top receipt. Gas station. Chevron. Dated 4 days earlier. The address was near the casino. Margaret folded the receipts into a drawer. Ellen drove home that afternoon and opened her laptop. She pulled up the tracker data and compared it to the fuel receipts she'd photographed over the past month. The odometer readings didn't match. The mileage was higher than the receipts accounted for. Not by much, just enough to notice if you were looking. She opened a new spreadsheet. Date, time, location, duration, fuel, mileage. She filled in the rows methodically, color-coding discrepancies in yellow. By the end of March, the pattern was undeniable. Margaret was visiting the casino 3 to 4 times per week, staying for 2 to 3 hours, returning home as if nothing had happened. Ellen called David. She hadn't spoken to him in 2 weeks. Hey, have you talked to Mom lately? Last Sunday. How'd she seem? Fine. Why? Ellen chose her words carefully. Dr. Liang thinks she might be having some memory issues. David sighed. She's 82. Everyone forgets things. I know. I just wanted to make sure you knew. I'll check in on her. Ellen hung up. She didn't mention the casino. She didn't mention the tracker. Not yet. The following week, Ellen visited her mother on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was dressed neatly: slacks, a blouse, low heels, lipstick. Her purse was on the counter. Heading out? Lunch with friends. Anyone I know? Church group. Ellen nodded. Have fun. She left, drove 3 blocks, and parked on a side street. She opened the tracker app and watched the blue dot. At 11:12 a.m., the dot began moving. It traveled west on Fair Oaks, merged onto Interstate 80, exited at Elkhorn. It stopped in the casino parking lot at 11:37. Ellen waited 20 minutes. Then she started her car and drove to the casino herself. The building was large, low, surrounded by asphalt. Rows of parked cars glinted in the midday sun. Ellen drove slowly through the lot, scanning license plates. She found her mother's Honda in the 3rd row, driver's side facing the entrance. And beside it, 1 space over, was a blue Toyota sedan. Ellen pulled into a spot across the aisle and turned off the engine. She sat very still. The casino entrance was 30 yards away, automatic glass doors, bright lights inside, the faint sound of slot machines audible even from the parking lot. At 11:51, the doors slid open. Margaret walked out, steady on her feet, no hesitation. She was smiling. Behind her, holding the door, was David. Ellen watched as they walked together to the cashier's window just inside the entrance. David pointed to something. Margaret nodded. They stood there for several minutes. Then they turned and walked deeper into the casino, disappearing into the rows of machines. Ellen took 5 photos. She timestamped each one. Then she started her car and drove home. That night, Ellen logged into the shared bank account her mother had set up years ago, the one linked to the life insurance payout. Her father had died 6 years earlier. The policy had been worth $185,000. Margaret had deposited it into a joint account, named both herself and David as signers, and used it sparingly for household expenses. Ellen had access to view the account, but not to make withdrawals. She pulled up the transaction history and scrolled back 3 months. Withdrawals. Cash. ATM. Always on weekdays. Always between $500 and $2,000. 15 transactions since January. Ellen added them up. $42,000. She sat back in her chair. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. She screenshot every transaction. She saved them to a folder on her desktop labeled MH Account Review. Then she closed the browser and sat in the dark. By early April, Ellen had compiled a comprehensive file. GPS logs, bank statements, photographs, fuel receipts, a columnar spreadsheet tracking every discrepancy. She kept it all in a locked drawer in her bedroom, organized by date. She hadn't confronted anyone. She hadn't been accused. She had simply watched, documented, and waited. One evening in mid-April, Ellen received a phone call from David. It was 8:30 p.m. She was washing dishes. Hey, I'm at Mom's. Just checking her smoke detectors. That's good. Yeah, she's doing fine. Still sharp. Ellen dried her hands. Has she mentioned anything unusual? Like what? I don't know. Just anything. David laughed. She's been having some good days, actually. She even went out to play bingo last week. Ellen paused. Bingo? Yeah, with her friends. Ellen didn't correct him. She just said, that's nice. After they hung up, Ellen replayed the conversation in her head. Good days. The phrase stuck. She opened her phone and started a voice memo app. The next time she spoke to David, she'd be ready. That opportunity came 3 days later. David called again, this time to ask about scheduling a family dinner for their mother's upcoming birthday in May. I think we should do something nice. Maybe take her out. Sure. She deserves it. Especially with all the stress lately. Ellen kept her voice neutral. What stress? You know, the whole memory thing. But honestly, she's been great. She even had a good day at the tables last week. Ellen's hand tightened around the phone. The tables? David paused. Then he laughed, awkward. I mean, you know, the card tables. At the senior center. Right. They talked for another minute, then hung up. Ellen immediately stopped the recording and saved it. She labeled the file David call April 19. She played it back twice. His slip was clear. A good day at the tables. Not bingo. Not the senior center. The tables. Ellen forwarded the audio file to her encrypted email and saved a backup to a USB drive. By late April, Ellen had begun researching elder law attorneys. She used private browsing, cleared her history, and avoided clicking on ads. She read reviews, checked credentials, looked for attorneys who specialized in conservatorship and undue influence. She found one. Carla Gwynn. I'm 54 years old. Small practice in Midtown Sacramento. Her website listed experience in elder financial abuse, capacity evaluations, and trust disputes. Ellen called the office on a Thursday morning. I'd like to schedule a consultation. The receptionist scheduled her for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. Ellen took a half-day off work. She drove to the office with a slim folder containing printed GPS logs, bank statements, and the audio file transcribed onto a single page. Carla Nguyen's office was neat and plain. Gray carpet, 2 chairs, a wooden desk with a lamp. Carla herself was compact, direct, with short dark hair and glasses. What brings you in? Ellen set the folder on the desk. I need advice about my mother. She explained the situation calmly. The diagnosis, the tracker, the casino visits, the withdrawals, the joint account with her brother, the recorded phone call. Carla listened without interrupting. When Ellen finished, Carla opened the folder and reviewed the documents in silence. After several minutes, she looked up. How much is left in the account? About $130,000. And your mother's cognitive status? Diagnosed with possible early dementia, but inconsistent. She functions normally most of the time. Carla leaned back. Capacity is contextual. If she was impaired when she agreed to add your brother as a signer, or if he's exerting undue influence now, those transactions could be challenged. Ellen nodded. What are my options? Carla tapped the folder. You could file for limited conservatorship. If the court finds evidence of impairment and exploitation, they can transfer control to you and restrict your brother's access. How long does that take? 3 to 6 months. Maybe faster with strong evidence. Ellen absorbed this. What do I need? More of what you already have. Medical records. Witness testimony if possible. Documentation of every financial irregularity. And a plan for how the funds should be managed going forward. Ellen left the office with a yellow legal pad covered in notes. She sat in her car for 10 minutes, reading them over. Then she drove to a FedEx store and made 3 copies of everything. She mailed one set to herself at her work address. She stored another in a safe deposit box at her bank. She kept the third in her locked drawer at home. By early May, Ellen had begun constructing a legal framework. She opened a new account at a different bank, a trust account titled the Hart Family Foundation for Medical Care. She listed herself and an independent trustee, a CPA she'd known professionally for years, as co-signers. Any withdrawal would require both signatures. She consulted with Carla again. They drafted a plan to transfer the remaining funds from the joint account into the trust. The transfer would be legal as long as it was done while Margaret still had capacity and with her consent, or if Ellen could demonstrate that the existing account structure was no longer in Margaret's best interest. Carla advised caution. Don't move anything yet. Build the case first. Let the evidence speak. Ellen agreed. She continued to monitor the account. The withdrawals continued. $800 on May 3rd, $1,200 on May 9th, $1,500 on May 14th. On May 17th, Ellen received an email notification forwarded by mistake. It was addressed to David, sent from the Golden Prairie Casino Loyalty Program. Your Gold Tier status has been renewed. The message included a summary of recent visits, complimentary offers, and reward points. Ellen screenshotted the email. She forwarded it to her encrypted account. Then she archived it. By late May, Ellen's file was comprehensive. GPS exports showing 63 casino visits over 4 months. Bank records showing $47,000 in withdrawals. Photographs of Margaret and David at the casino entrance. The recorded phone call. The forwarded email. Medical records documenting cognitive inconsistency. She met with Carla one more time. I'm ready. Carla reviewed the updated file. She spent 20 minutes going through each document, cross-referencing dates, checking timestamps, and verifying consistency. Finally, she closed the folder. This is solid. If we file, we'll likely win. Ellen nodded. But you need to decide what you want the outcome to be. I want her protected. And I want the money used for her care, not for gambling. Carla made a note. Then we'll request limited conservatorship with financial oversight. You'll manage the account. Your brother will be restricted. How soon can we file? 2 weeks. Ellen left the office and drove to her mother's house. It was late afternoon. Margaret was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for dinner. You're here late. Ellen sat at the table. I wanted to talk. Margaret rinsed her hands and sat down across from her. About? Ellen chose her words carefully. I've been thinking about Dad's insurance money. Margaret's expression didn't change. What about it? I think it should be moved into a trust. For your medical care. So it's protected. Margaret frowned. It's fine where it is. Mom, it's been going up pretty fast. I know how to manage my own money. Ellen kept her voice gentle. I know. I just think this would be safer. Margaret stood. I'm not discussing this. Ellen didn't push. She just nodded and left. That night, she emailed Carla. Let's proceed. On June 2nd, Carla filed a petition for limited conservatorship in Sacramento County Superior Court. The filing included all supporting documents, medical records, GPS logs, bank statements, the recorded call, the email, and Ellen's affidavit. David received notification by mail on June 8th. He called Ellen that same evening, his voice tight. What the hell is this? It's a conservatorship petition. You're trying to take control of Mom's money. I'm trying to protect it. From who? Me? Ellen didn't answer. David exhaled sharply. This is insane. She's fine. Then that's what the court will decide. He hung up. Margaret called the next day. Her voice was quiet. Ellen, what are you doing? I'm making sure you're safe. I don't need this. I think you do. There was a long silence. Then Margaret said, I won't fight you. I'm not asking you to. They didn't speak again for 2 weeks. The court scheduled a hearing for early October. In the meantime, Ellen continued monitoring the account. The withdrawals slowed, but didn't stop. David called twice, both times angry, both times accusing Ellen of overreach. She listened calmly and said very little. By late June, Ellen had taken one more step. She met with Margaret at the bank, accompanied by Carla. They explained the trust structure. Margaret listened without expression. It's still your money, but it can only be used for medical care and living expenses. 2 people have to approve every withdrawal. Margaret looked at Ellen. And you're one of them. Yes. Margaret signed the paperwork. Carla witnessed. The remaining funds, $128,000, were transferred into the trust account that afternoon. David was not notified until the transfer was complete. When he found out, he called Ellen at work, shouting, "You can't do this. It's done. I'm going to fight it. That's your choice." He hung up. Ellen saved the voicemail. By mid-July, the case file was complete. Ellen had added 3 more months of data, continued casino visits, additional withdrawals before the transfer, and a supplemental medical evaluation arranged by Carla showing stable, but contextually inconsistent cognitive function. She met with Carla in early August to review trial preparation. "We present the evidence. We show the pattern. We argue that the prior account structure enabled exploitation and that your mother's capacity to resist influence was compromised." What will David say? He'll argue she was competent, that the visits were voluntary, that he was just accompanying her. Ellen nodded. And the withdrawals? He'll say she authorized them. But we have timestamps showing he was present for most of the transactions. And we have the recorded call where he references good days at the tables. Ellen looked at the folder on the desk, now 2 inches thick, tabbed and indexed. "How strong is it?" Carla met her eyes. "Very." The hearing was set for October 4th. Ellen took the day off. She dressed in a gray suit, minimal jewelry, and flat shoes. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 a.m. and met Carla in the hallway outside courtroom 5. Margaret arrived at 8:50, escorted by a neighbor. She wore a wool coat and sat on a bench near the water fountain, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at Ellen. David arrived at 9:05 alone. He wore a dark suit and kept adjusting his tie. He glanced at Ellen once, then looked away. At 9:15, the clerk called the case. In the matter of Margaret Hart, conservatorship petition. They entered the courtroom. The judge was a woman in her 60s, gray hair, and reading glasses. She reviewed the file for several minutes in silence. Then she looked up. "Ms. Hart, you're requesting limited conservatorship over your mother's financial affairs." Ellen stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "On what grounds?" "Cognitive impairment and financial exploitation." The judge turned to Carla. "Counsel, summarize your evidence." Carla stood and presented the case methodically. She submitted the GPS logs as Exhibit A, showing 63 casino visits over 4 months. She submitted the bank statements as Exhibit B, showing $47,000 in withdrawals during that same period. She submitted the recorded phone call as Exhibit C, in which David referenced good days at the tables. She submitted the medical evaluation as Exhibit D, documenting cognitive inconsistency. The judge reviewed each exhibit. She asked 3 questions. Carla answered each with precision. Then the judge turned to David. "Mr. Hart, do you contest these facts?" David stood. "Your Honor, my mother is a competent adult. She wanted to go to the casino. I just went with her." "And the withdrawals?" "She authorized them." "For what purpose?" David hesitated. "She wanted to play." The judge made a note. "And you facilitated this?" "I didn't stop her." "Did you advise her against it?" David didn't answer. The judge looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Hart, do you understand what's being discussed here?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." "Do you want to continue going to the casino?" Margaret looked at her hands. "I don't know." "Do you want your son managing your money?" Margaret shook her head. "No." The judge made another note. Then she closed the file. "I'm granting limited conservatorship to Ellen Hart. She will manage all financial accounts. David Hart is barred from accessing or influencing the use of these funds. This order is effective immediately." The clerk stamped the file. Approved. October 4th, 2022. They stood. The judge left. Ellen gathered her papers. Carla touched her shoulder briefly. "It's done." Ellen nodded. She looked across the aisle. David was staring at her, his jaw tight. He didn't say anything. He just walked out. Margaret sat on the bench for a long time. Then she stood and left without speaking. Ellen drove home alone. She parked in her driveway and sat in the car for several minutes. The court order was in her bag. She didn't take it out. She just sat there, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. By late October, the new structure was in place. Ellen received notification letters from the bank confirming her authority. She set up automatic alerts for all account activity. She reduced Margaret's debit card limit to $500 per month for groceries and personal expenses. All other withdrawals required 2 signatures, hers and the CPA trustees. The casino visits stopped. Ellen checked the tracker app every few days. The car stayed parked at the house. Margaret's routine became simple again: grocery store, pharmacy, church on Sundays. No more trips to Elkhorn Boulevard. No more late-night drives. In early November, Ellen visited her mother for the first time since the hearing. Margaret answered the door quietly. They sat in the living room. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Margaret said, "You didn't have to do that." "I did. He'll never forgive you." "I know." Margaret looked out the window. "It wasn't what you think." Ellen waited. "Your father hated gambling. He thought it was foolish. After he died, I wanted to do something he wouldn't have allowed. Something that was mine." Ellen nodded slowly. "And David?" Margaret's voice was very quiet. "He needed money." "I didn't know how to say no." They sat in silence. Then Ellen stood. "The money's still there, Mom. It's just protected now." Margaret didn't respond. Ellen drove home. That night, she opened the tracker app for the last time. The blue dot glowed on the map, parked, stationary, exactly where it should be. She closed the app and set the phone down. By December, winter had returned. Short days, early darkness. Margaret attended a few sessions of light cognitive therapy, arranged through her insurance. The therapist reported stable function, no progression of impairment. Ellen managed the bills remotely. Utilities, insurance, property taxes. Everything paid on time. She sent Margaret a monthly statement showing the account balance. Margaret never called to discuss it. David sent 2 text messages in December. The first said, "Can I stop by for Christmas?" Ellen replied, "Not this year." The second said, "You destroyed this family." Ellen didn't reply. On December 28th, Ellen and Margaret drove past the casino on the way to a medical appointment. Margaret looked out the window as they passed the exit. Ellen glanced over. "You okay?" Margaret nodded. "I don't miss it." Ellen believed her. By early January 2023, the account had stabilized. No unusual activity. No unexpected charges. The balance held steady at $126,000. Ellen reduced her monitoring to weekly checks. The tracker stayed installed, but she stopped opening the app daily. It ran in the background, logging trips to the store, to church, to the doctor's office. Ordinary life. In February, Ellen archived the case file. She saved everything to an encrypted external drive and stored it in her safe deposit box. She printed one final summary, dates, transactions, outcomes, and filed it in a folder labeled MH Conservatorship, closed. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't celebrate. She just closed the folder and put it away. Nora asked once over coffee how things were. "Stable. Your mom okay?" "She's fine." Nora didn't push. By March, spring had started to return. Ellen reduced her visits to once a week. Margaret seemed quieter, but not withdrawn. She planted seeds in the backyard, read library books, and watched television in the evenings. One Saturday in late March, Ellen arrived to find Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing something by hand. "What's that?" "Just a list." Ellen sat down. "Can I see?" Margaret turned the notebook around. It was a list of expenses, groceries, utilities, medication. Each line had a date and an amount. At the bottom, she'd written the total and subtracted it from the account balance Ellen had sent her. "I wanted to make sure I understood." Ellen nodded. "It's all accurate." Margaret closed the notebook. "I'm sorry." Ellen didn't ask what for. She just said, "I know." They sat quietly. Then Margaret asked, "Do you hate him?" "No. He thinks you do." Ellen considered this. "I just couldn't let it continue." Margaret nodded. "I know." That was the last time they discussed it. By April, Ellen had begun thinking about the tracker again. It had been installed for over a year. The device was still working, still logging every trip, still sending updates to her phone. But she didn't need it anymore. The court order was permanent. The financial structure was locked. The crisis had passed. On April 15th, she opened the app one last time. She scrolled through the trip history, hundreds of entries, thousands of miles, a full year of Margaret's movements reduced to blue lines on a map. She tapped the settings menu. She selected Remove Device. A prompt appeared. Are you sure you want to delete this tracker? All data will be permanently removed. Ellen paused. Then she tapped Confirm. The screen went blank. The app returned to the home menu. No devices found. She deleted the app from her phone. The tracker itself stayed installed under the steering column. Ellen never removed it. It just sat there, dormant, a small black box no one thought about. By May 2024, more than a year had passed since the hearing. Ellen had settled into a new rhythm. She managed her mother's account with quiet efficiency. Margaret lived independently, stable, safe. David sent occasional texts, birthday wishes, holiday greetings, always brief, always distant. Ellen replied politely. Nothing more. On a warm afternoon in late May, Ellen visited her mother for a routine check-in. Margaret was in the backyard, kneeling by the garden bed, folding seed packets and sorting them into labeled envelopes. Ellen stood on the porch, watching. The yard was quiet except for the sound of birds in the trees. A sparrow landed on the fence, tilted its head, then flew away. Margaret looked up and saw her. You're early. I finished work early. Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her knees. She walked over and sat on the porch steps. Ellen sat beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. The sunlight slanted across the yard, warm and golden. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded, faint and brief. Finally, Margaret said, Do you think he'll ever forgive me? Ellen didn't answer right away. Then she said, I don't know. Margaret nodded. I don't think I will either. Ellen looked at her. Forgive him. Forgive myself. They sat in silence. Then Margaret reached over and touched Ellen's hand, just briefly. Thank you. Ellen nodded. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They sat together until the sun dropped below the fence line and the yard filled with shadow. Then Ellen stood. I should go. Margaret nodded. Drive safe. Ellen walked to her car and got in. She started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Margaret was still sitting on the porch steps, watching her go. Ellen turned the corner and the house disappeared from view. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. The house was quiet. She thought about the tracker, about the blue dot moving across the map, about the months she'd spent watching and waiting and building a case. She thought about her mother's face in the courtroom, blank and unreadable. She thought about David's anger, about his accusations, about the silence that had grown between them. She thought about the money, still sitting in the trust account, still protected, still there. And she thought about the question Margaret had asked. Do you think he'll ever forgive me? Ellen didn't know. She didn't know if forgiveness was even the right word for what had happened. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was just acceptance. Acceptance that people make choices, that those choices have consequences, and that sometimes the only thing you can do is step in and stop the damage before it gets worse. She finished her tea and rinsed the cup. Then she turned off the lights and went to bed. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the window. She got dressed, made coffee, and checked her email. There was one new message from the bank, an automated monthly statement for the trust account. She opened it. The balance was unchanged. No withdrawals. No unusual activity. Everything is stable. She closed the email and set the phone down. Outside, a bird sang in the tree near her window. She looked out and saw a sparrow on a branch, small and quick, hopping from twig to twig. She watched it for a moment. Then she turned away and started her day. By June, the case had faded into the background of Ellen's life. It was no longer something she thought about every day. It was just something that had happened, something she had handled, something that was over. She saw her mother once a week. They talked about ordinary things: the weather, the garden, the news. They didn't talk about the casino. They didn't talk about David. They didn't talk about the hearing. They just existed in the same space, polite and careful, the way families do when the truth has been spoken and there's nothing left to say. One evening in early June, Ellen sat in her car after visiting her mother. She had parked in the driveway but hadn't turned off the engine yet. She just sat there, hands on the wheel, looking at the house. The porch light was on. Through the window, she could see her mother moving around the kitchen, putting away dishes, wiping down the counter. The movements were slow but steady. Familiar. Ellen thought about the tracker again. About the moment she had deleted the app. About the way the screen had gone blank, just like that, as if the past year had never happened. But it happened. And it would always be part of them, whether they talked about it or not. She put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. As she drove home, she passed the exit for Elkhorn Boulevard. The casino sign was visible in the distance, lit up against the darkening sky. She didn't slow down. She didn't look. She just kept driving. By July, Ellen had started thinking about the future. About retirement, about travel, about what came next. She was 49 now. Her daughter was finishing her senior year of college. Life was moving forward. One afternoon, Nora asked her if she'd ever thought about relocating. Where would I go? I don't know. Somewhere new. Ellen considered this. Maybe. Someday. But she didn't think she would. Sacramento was home. Her mother was here. And despite everything, despite the distance and the silence, Ellen wasn't ready to leave. She thought about this on a Saturday morning in late July. She was sitting on her back patio with coffee, watching the light move across the lawn. Her phone was on the table beside her, screen down, silent. She hadn't checked the trust account in 2 weeks. She hadn't called her mother in 3 days. She hadn't heard from David in months. And that was fine. That was enough. She finished her coffee and went inside. By August, Ellen had settled into a new kind of peace. It wasn't happiness exactly. It wasn't satisfying. It was just the absence of urgency. The absence of fear. Her mother was safe. The money was protected. The system was working. And Ellen had done what needed to be done. She didn't regret it. She didn't second-guess it. She just carried it quietly, the way you carry any difficult decision, lightly, carefully, without looking back. One evening in mid-August, she received a text from David. It was the first message he'd sent in 4 months. How is she? Ellen stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed back. She's fine. He didn't reply. Ellen set the phone down and looked out the window. The sky was turning pink, the last light fading into dusk. She thought about her brother. About the way he used to make their mother laugh. About the way he'd helped fix things around the house after their father died. About the way he'd stood beside her at the funeral, holding her hand. And she thought about the casino. About the withdrawals. About the money disappearing, month after month, while their mother sat at the kitchen table and pretended everything was fine. She didn't forgive him. But she didn't hate him either. She just let him go. By September, fall had returned. The days were shorter again. The light softer. Ellen drove to her mother's house on a Sunday afternoon and found her in the backyard, raking leaves into a pile. You shouldn't be doing that. Margaret looked up. I'm fine. Ellen took the rake. Let me. They worked together in silence, Ellen raking and Margaret gathering the leaves into bags. When they finished, they sat on the porch steps, just like they had in May. Margaret looked tired. I've been thinking about your father. Ellen nodded. He always said money wasn't worth fighting over. Ellen didn't respond. He was wrong. Ellen looked at her. What do you mean? Margaret folded her hands. Money's just paper. But what you do with it, that's worth fighting for. They sat quietly. Then Margaret stood. I'm glad you did what you did. Ellen stood too. Are you? Margaret nodded. I couldn't stop him. But you could. She went inside. Ellen stayed on the porch for a few more minutes, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. Then she got in her car and drove home. By October, the second anniversary of the hearing, Ellen had stopped marking time by what had happened. The case was no longer a dividing line. It was just part of the past, folded into everything else. She saw her mother regularly. They talked. They shared meals. They existed together without tension, without silence, without the weight of accusation. And that was enough. One evening in late October, Ellen opened her laptop and pulled up the archived case file. She hadn't looked at it in months. She scrolled through the documents, GPS logs, bank statements, court orders. It all seemed so distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. She closed the file and shut the laptop. Then she walked outside and stood on her porch, looking up at the sky. The stars were bright and cold. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a car passing, the sound fading into the night. She thought about her mother, sitting in her house across town, probably watching television or reading a book. She thought about David, wherever he was, living his own life, carrying his own regrets. And she thought about herself, 49 years old, standing alone in the dark, trying to decide if what she'd done was right. She didn't have an answer. She didn't think she ever would. But she'd done it anyway. And it was over. And her mother was safe. And that was all that mattered. By November, Thanksgiving arrived. Ellen invited her mother to her house for dinner. Margaret accepted. They ate quietly, just the two of them, and talked about nothing important. After dinner, they sat in the living room. Margaret looked around at the walls, the furniture, the small details. "You've done well for yourself." Ellen nodded. "I've been lucky." Margaret smiled faintly. Luck had nothing to do with it. They sat in comfortable silence. Then Margaret said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found out?" Ellen thought about this. "Every day." "What do you think?" "I think you would have taken everything." Margaret nodded. "Me too." They didn't speak again until Margaret left an hour later. Ellen walked her to the door and watched her drive away. Then she went back inside and cleaned up the dishes. The house was quiet. The evening felt long. She thought about the tracker again. About the blue dot moving across the map. About the first time she'd seen the casino parking lot on the screen. And she thought about the moment she'd deleted the app. About the way the screen had gone blank. Sometimes the end of something isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just a button you press and a screen that goes dark. She finished the dishes and turned off the lights. By December 2024, winter had settled in again. Ellen marked 2 years since she'd first installed the tracker. The device was still there, plugged in under the steering column, forgotten. She thought about retrieving it once. But she never did. It didn't matter anymore. Her mother was stable. The account was safe. The system was working. And Ellen had learned something important. That sometimes protection looks like control. That sometimes love looks like surveillance. That sometimes the only way to save someone is to stop trusting them. She didn't know if that was a good lesson or a bad one. She just knew it was true. On a cold morning in mid-December, Ellen drove past the casino one more time. The parking lot was full. Cars glittering under the lights. People walking through the glass doors, hopeful and unaware. She didn't slow down. She didn't look. She just kept driving. By the end of December, Ellen had started thinking about the new year. About resolutions, about plans, about what came next. She didn't have any answers. But she didn't need them. She had done what needed to be done. She had protected her mother. She had stood up to her brother. She had built a system that worked. And that was enough. On New Year's Eve, she stayed home. She poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood lights flicker in the dark. At midnight, fireworks went off somewhere in the distance. She heard them but didn't see them. She thought about the past 2 years. About everything that had happened. About everything that had changed. And she thought about the tracker. About the app she'd deleted. About the data that was gone now, erased, lost to the cloud. But the truth remained. The truth always remained. Her mother had lied. Her brother had stolen. And Ellen had stopped them both. Not with anger. Not with drama. Just with patience, with proof, with a plan. And in the end, that was the only kind of justice that mattered. She finished her wine and went to bed. By January 2025, Ellen had stopped thinking about the case almost entirely. It was just part of her history now. Something that had happened. Something she had handled. Something that was over. She saw her mother every week. They talked about small things. They didn't talk about the money. They didn't talk about David. They didn't talk about the tracker. They just existed together, quietly, the way families do when they've survived something difficult and decided not to speak of it again. And that was fine. One morning in late January, Ellen woke early and made coffee. She stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the gray sky. It was cold. The trees were bare. She thought about her mother. About the woman she'd been before the diagnosis. Before the casino. Before the lies. And she thought about the woman she'd become after. Quieter. Smaller. More careful. Ellen wondered if her mother regretted it. If she thought about those trips to the casino, about the money she'd lost, about the trust she'd broken. But Ellen never asked. And her mother never said. Some things were better left unspoken. Ellen finished her coffee and got ready for work. By February, Ellen had started preparing her taxes. She pulled up the trust account and reviewed the annual summary. $124,000. Stable. Protected. Safe. She printed the statement and filed it with her other tax documents. Then she closed the browser and shut down the computer. Outside, the winter light was beginning to shift. The days were getting longer. Spring was coming. Ellen thought about the tracker one more time. About the blue dot. About the routes. About the way it had all started. And she thought about the way it had ended. Quietly. Completely. Without fanfare. She stood and walked to the window. A sparrow landed on the fence outside, small and quick. It hopped along the railing, tilted its head, then flew away. Ellen watched it disappear into the trees. She thought about her mother, sitting in her house across town, probably making breakfast or folding laundry or watering the plants. She thought about David, somewhere in the city, living his own life, carrying his own regrets. And she thought about herself. 49 years old. Single. A daughter in college. A mother who was safe. A brother who was gone. And she thought about the words her mother had said on the porch that day in September. Money's just paper. But what you do with it, that's worth fighting for. Ellen nodded to herself, quietly, in the empty kitchen. Then she turned away from the window and started her day. By March 2025, more than 3 years had passed since the first diagnosis. More than 2 years since the hearing. More than 1 year since Ellen had deleted the app. And everything was fine. Her mother was fine. The money was fine. The system was fine. And Ellen was fine too. She didn't think about the tracker anymore. She didn't think about the casino. She didn't think about the blue dot moving across the map. She just lived her life, one day at a time, quietly and carefully, the way she always had. One afternoon in late March, she drove to her mother's house for a routine visit. Margaret was in the backyard, planting seeds in the garden bed. The soil was dark and fresh. The sun was warm. Ellen stood on the porch, watching. Margaret looked up and waved. "You're early." "I finished work early." Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her hands. She walked over and sat on the porch steps. Ellen sat beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. The yard was quiet except for the sound of birds. A sparrow landed on the fence, then flew away. Ellen thought about everything that had happened. About the tracker. About the casino. About the hearing. About trust. About the money. About the silence that had grown between her and David. About the distance that had grown between her and her mother. And she thought about the fact that none of it could be undone. That it was all just part of their story now, folded into everything else, permanent and unchangeable. Margaret looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" Ellen shook her head. "Nothing." They sat together until the sun dropped below the fence line and the yard filled with shadow. Then Ellen stood. "I should go." Margaret nodded. "Drive safe." Ellen walked to her car and got in. She started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Margaret was still sitting on the porch steps, watching her go. Ellen turned the corner and the house disappeared from view. She drove home slowly, taking the long way, passing the old neighborhoods and the familiar streets. She passed the exit for Elkhorn Boulevard. She didn't look. When she got home, she parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes. The engine ticked as it cooled. The street was quiet. She thought about the tracker one last time. About the device still plugged in under the steering column, forgotten, dormant, no longer connected to anything. She thought about the app she'd deleted, about the data that was gone, about the routes that were erased. And she thought about the fact that none of it mattered anymore. The tracker had done its job. The truth had been revealed. The problem had been solved. And now it was over. Ellen got out of the car and walked to her front door. She unlocked it and went inside. The house was warm and quiet. She set her keys on the counter and poured a glass of water. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the street. The light was fading. The sky was turning pink. She thought about her mother. About the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. About the choices she'd made and the consequences she'd lived with. And Ellen thought about herself. About the choices she'd made. About surveillance. About the legal battle. About trust. About the way she'd taken control. She didn't regret it. She didn't apologize for it. She just carried it, the way you carry any difficult truth, lightly, carefully, without looking back. She finished her water and set the glass down. Then she turned away from the window and started dinner. By April, spring had fully arrived. The trees were green. The air was warm. Ellen's mother planted tomatoes and peppers in the backyard. Ellen visited on weekends and helped her stake the plants. They worked together in comfortable silence. Margaret's hands were steady. Her movements were sure. She seemed more present than she had in years. One afternoon, Ellen asked, "Do you feel better?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I feel different." "Different how?" "Lighter." Ellen nodded. She understood. They finished planting and sat on the porch steps. The sun was warm. The birds were singing. Margaret looked at her. "I'm grateful." Ellen didn't ask what for. She just said, "I know." They sat together until the sun began to set. Then Ellen stood. "I should go." Margaret nodded. "See you next week." Ellen walked to her car. She got in and started the engine. She sat there for a moment, looking at the house. The porch light came on. Margaret appeared in the doorway, waving. Ellen waved back. Then she put the car in reverse and drove away. As she turned the corner, she thought about the tracker. About the blue dot. About the months she'd spent watching and waiting. And she thought about the fact that she'd never told her mother about it. That Margaret probably still didn't know the device was there, plugged in under the steering column, silent and dormant. Ellen wondered if she should remove it. If she should tell her mother. If she should close that final loop. But she didn't. She just let it be. Because some things were better left alone. Some secrets were better kept. Some truths were better left unspoken. Ellen drove home. She parked in the driveway. She went inside. She made dinner. She ate alone. She watched television. She went to bed. And the next day, she woke up and did it all again. Because that's what life was. Small routines. Quiet days. Ordinary moments. The steady passage of time, marked by nothing more than the changing light and the turning seasons. And Ellen was fine with that. She'd had enough drama. Enough crisis. Enough tension. Now she just wanted peace. And she had it. By May, Ellen's daughter graduated from college. Ellen drove to the ceremony and sat in the bleachers, watching her walk across the stage. Afterward, they took photos. They went to dinner. They talked about the future. Her daughter was moving to Seattle for a job. Ellen was happy for her. Proud. That night, Ellen drove home alone. The highway was dark. The road was empty. She thought about her own life. About the choices she'd made. About the woman she'd become. She was 49 years old. Single. A mother whose daughter was leaving. A daughter whose mother was aging. A sister whose brother was gone. But she was okay. She was stable. She was safe. And that was enough. She pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine. The street was quiet. The house was dark. She sat there for a moment, looking at the shadows. Then she got out of the car and went inside. By June, Ellen had started thinking about retirement. About what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. About travel, about hobbies, about change. But she didn't make any decisions. She just let the thoughts sit, quiet and patient, waiting for the right time. One evening, she sat on her back patio with a glass of wine, watching the light fade from the sky. Her phone was on the table beside her. The screen was dark. She thought about the tracker, about the app, about the blue dot, about the way it had all started. And she thought about the way it had all ended. Quietly, completely, without fanfare. She thought about her mother, safe in her house across town. About David, wherever he was, living his own life. About herself, sitting alone in the dark, trying to decide if what she'd done was right. And she realized something. It didn't matter if it was right. It only mattered that it was done. She'd protected her mother. She'd stopped her brother. She'd built a system that worked. And that was enough. She finished her wine and went inside. By July, Ellen had stopped thinking about the case entirely. It was just part of the past now. Something that had happened. Something she'd handled. Something that was over. She saw her mother once a week. They talked about small things. They didn't talk about the money. They didn't talk about David. They didn't talk about the tracker. They just existed together, quietly, the way families do when they've survived something difficult and decided not to speak of it again. And that was fine. That was enough. One morning in late July, Ellen woke early and made coffee. She stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the bright summer sky. The day was clear and warm. She thought about her mother. About the woman she'd been. About the woman she'd become. And she thought about the tracker. About the blue dot. About the routes. About the surveillance. And she thought about the fact that she'd never regretted it. Not once. Because sometimes protection requires watching. Sometimes love requires vigilance. Sometimes the only way to keep someone safe is to know exactly where they are. Ellen finished her coffee and got ready for work. The day ahead was ordinary. Predictable. Safe. And that was exactly what she wanted. By August, Ellen had settled into a final kind of peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've done everything you could. The kind that comes from letting go. She didn't think about the tracker anymore. She didn't think about the casino. She didn't think about the hearing. She just lived her life. Quietly. Carefully. One day at a time. And her mother was safe. And the money was protected. And the system was working. And that was all that mattered. One afternoon in late August, Ellen drove to her mother's house. Margaret was in the backyard, sitting on a lawn chair, reading a book. She looked up when Ellen arrived. "You're here." "I'm here." Ellen sat down beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. The yard was quiet. The sun was warm. Finally, Margaret closed her book. "I've been thinking." Ellen waited. "About what happened?" Ellen nodded. "I want you to know something." "What?" Margaret looked at her. "You saved me." Ellen didn't respond. "I couldn't save myself." "But you could. And you did." They sat in silence. Then Margaret stood. "Thank you." She went inside. Ellen stayed in the yard for a few more minutes, looking at the garden, at the fence, at the sky. Then she got up and left. She drove home slowly. The streets were familiar. The light was soft. She thought about her mother's words. "You saved me." Ellen didn't know if that was true. She didn't know if saving someone was the right word for what she'd done. But she'd done it anyway. And her mother was safe. And that was enough. She parked in her driveway. She went inside. She made dinner. She ate alone. She watched the sky turn dark through the window. And she thought about the tracker. About the blue dot. About the way it had all started. She thought about the moment she'd installed the device. About the fear. About the suspicion. About the need to know. And she thought about the moment she'd deleted the app. About the relief. About the closure. About the fact that it was over. And she realized something. The tracker had been a tool. Nothing more. A way to see what was hidden. A way to find the truth. And the truth had been painful. And necessary. And unavoidable. But it had also been the beginning of something new. Something better. Something safer. Ellen stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the dark street. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a car passing. The sound faded into the night. She thought about her mother. About the way she'd looked in the yard that afternoon. About the way she'd said thank you. And Ellen thought about herself. about the choices she'd made, about the woman she'd become. And she thought about the fact that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is watch someone you love make terrible choices and decide to step in. Because stepping in means taking control. And taking control means breaking trust. And breaking trust means accepting that the relationship will never be the same. But Ellen had done it anyway. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was watching her mother lose everything. Watching her brother take it all. Watching the lie continue until there was nothing left. And Ellen couldn't do that. She couldn't stand by and watch. So she'd watched in a different way. Carefully. Strategically. Quietly. And she'd stopped it. And her mother was safe. And that was enough. Ellen turned away from the window and went to bed. By September, fall was beginning. The days were shorter. The air was cooler. Ellen drove to her mother's house on a Sunday afternoon and found her raking leaves in the backyard. "Let me help." Margaret handed her the rake. They worked together in silence. When they finished, they sat on the porch steps. Margaret looked tired. "I'm getting old." Ellen nodded. "We all are. Do you ever think about what comes next?" "Sometimes. What do you think?" Ellen considered this. "I think we just keep going." Margaret nodded. "That's all we can do." They sat quietly. Then Margaret stood. "Come inside. I'll make tea." They went inside. Ellen sat at the kitchen table while Margaret filled the kettle. The house was warm and familiar. The light through the window was soft. Margaret brought the tea and sat down. They drank in silence. Finally, Ellen said, "Are you happy?" Margaret looked at her. "I don't know if happy is the right word." "What is the right word?" Margaret thought about this. "Stable." Ellen nodded. "That's good." "It is." They finished their tea. Ellen stood to leave. "I'll see you next week." Margaret walked her to the door. "Drive safe." Ellen got in her car and drove home. The streets were quiet. The sky was turning pink. She thought about her mother. About the woman she was now. About the fact that she was stable. And Ellen thought about herself. About the fact that she was stable too. And that was enough. That was all anyone could ask for. Stability. Safety. Peace. Ellen drove home and parked in the driveway. She got out and walked to the door. She unlocked it and went inside. The house was quiet. The evening stretched ahead. She made dinner. She ate. She watched television. She went to bed. And the next day, she woke up and did it all again. Because that's what life was. Small routines. Quiet days. Ordinary moments. And Ellen was fine with that. She'd had enough drama. Enough crisis. Enough tension. Now she just wanted peace. And she had it. And her mother was safe. And the money was protected. And the system was working. And that was all that mattered. By October, 2 years and 11 months had passed since Ellen had deleted the tracker app. Almost 3 years since the hearing. Almost 4 years since the diagnosis. And everything was fine. Stable. Safe. Protected. Ellen saw her mother once a week. They talked about small things. They had tea. They sat together. They were comfortable. And David was gone. Not physically gone, but gone from their lives. A distant memory. A name that came up occasionally, but meant less and less with each passing month. Ellen didn't miss him. She didn't think about him. She'd made her choice. And she'd accepted the consequences. And her mother was safe. And that was enough. One evening in late October, Ellen sat on her back patio with a blanket and a cup of tea. The air was cold. The sky was clear. She looked up at the stars and thought about the past few years. About the tracker. About surveillance. About the evidence. About the hearing. About trust. About the way she'd taken control. And she thought about the fact that she'd never told anyone the full story. Not Nora. Not her daughter. Not even her mother. It was just something she'd done. Something she carried. Something private and permanent. And that was fine. Some stories didn't need to be told. Some truths didn't need to be shared. Ellen finished her tea and went inside. She locked the door. She turned off the lights. She went to bed. And she slept well. Because she'd done what needed to be done. And her mother was safe. And the system was working. And that was enough. That was all that mattered. The next morning, Ellen woke to sunlight. She got dressed. She made coffee. She stood by the window and looked out at the street. A sparrow landed on the fence outside, small and quick. It hopped along the railing, tilted its head, then flew away. Ellen watched it disappear into the trees. She thought about her mother, sitting in her house across town, probably making breakfast or folding laundry or reading the newspaper. She thought about David, somewhere in the city, living his own life, carrying his own regrets. And she thought about herself. 49 years old. Single. A daughter who had moved away. A mother who was aging. A brother who was gone. But stable. Safe. Protected. At peace. And she thought about the tracker. About the small black box still plugged in under the steering column of her mother's car, forgotten, dormant, no longer connected to anything. And she thought about the fact that she'd never removed it. That it was still there, a silent witness to everything that had happened. And she thought about the fact that she probably never would remove it. Because some things were better left alone. Some artifacts were better left in place. Some reminders were better left unspoken. Ellen turned away from the window. She finished her coffee. She got ready for work. And as she locked the door and walked to her car, she thought one last time about the tracker. About the blue dot. About the routes. About surveillance. About the truth. And she thought about her mother. About the fact that she was safe now. About the fact that the money was protected. About the fact that the system was working. And Ellen thought about the words her mother had said that day in the backyard. "You saved me." And Ellen realized that maybe that was true. Maybe she had saved her mother. Not from dementia. Not from aging. But from something else. From exploitation. From loss. From the slow erosion of everything her father had worked for. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the only kind of saving that mattered. Ellen got in her car. She started the engine. She backed out of the driveway and drove to work. And as she drove, she thought about the tracker one last time. About the small black box. About the blue dot. About the way it had all started. And she thought about the way it had all ended. Quietly. Completely. Without fanfare. And she thought about the fact that sometimes the only way to protect someone is to watch them. To track them. To know exactly where they are and what they're doing. And sometimes that means crossing lines. Breaking trust. Taking control. But sometimes it's the only choice you have. The only way to stop the damage. The only way to save what's left. And Ellen had made that choice. And she lived with the consequences. And her mother was safe. And that was enough. That was all that mattered. Ellen drove to work. She parked. She went inside. She sat at her desk. She opened her computer. She started her day. And the tracker stayed where it was. Silent. Dormant. Forgotten. A small black box under the steering column of a silver Honda Accord. A witness to everything that had happened. A reminder of everything that had been lost and everything that had been saved. And Ellen never thought about it again. Because the story was over. The crisis had passed. The system was working. And her mother was safe. And the money was protected. And the truth had been told. And Ellen had done what needed to be done. And that was enough. That was all that mattered. She wasn't lost. She just didn't want to be found. Every story here will stir your soul. Welcome to Spice and Sugar, your daily escape into real emotions, bold lives, and unforgettable lessons. Here, it's all about love, loss, laughter, and the quiet strength that carries us through. I share stories that make you feel, that remind you you're not alone, that every bitter moment can lead to something sweet. If you want to laugh, cry, and see life through stories that heal and inspire, subscribe and stay a while.